Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to the first edition of the Moggcast in this new year. I'm Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you and to everybody who is kind enough to listen.
And let's start the new year by thinking back to one of the main topics of conversation in the old one. I'm not going to say Brexit because the listeners can take it for granted. We're going to talk about nothing else this morning. But it's an aspect of what is in front of us. One of your themes throughout last year was that once the withdrawal bill became an act, there was very little, really, the Commons, the legislature, rather than the executive, could do to stop Brexit. In the light of the Speaker's behaviour last week, do you think that is still true?
Yes, I do think that is still true. I think there are a number of obstacles, even if control of the timetable is taken by MPs, that relate to standing orders and to our constitutional norms. So, yes, an amendment could be put to standing orders, or more accurately, an order of the House of Commons could be made to decide that all stages of a bill could be taken in one day and the time limits for it could be set out. That is done frequently. It was done last for a Northern Ireland bill in December. The difficulty is that there are various stages of the bill, and depending upon what the bill does, some of these things require ministerial consent. So, any bill that requires expenditure needs a motion approving the expenditure. It's completely routine. Every bill, and this has been used or refused to stop.
Do you mind me interjecting just to ask, because our listeners will be asking, can the Speaker not change that too? He seems to think he can change anything he likes without wanting to be unfair to him.
Well, I think these two things can't be changed. The expenditure approval is rooted in the whole basis of our Constitution, that it is not for the Commons to put a charge on the public. This has to be to meet a request from the executive. This is how our whole system is based. And so motion that needs to be laid is normally laid at second reading, but in committee, a clause that authorises expenditure cannot be considered until this motion has been passed. Now, committee is, of course, not controlled by the Speaker, but is controlled by the Chairman of Ways and Means. So the bill could have a second reading, it could go into committee, but it could then get completely stuck in committee unless the relevant motion was passed. So that's one of the issues. Now, you could have a bill that didn't require any expenditure but gave an instruction. So that might solve that problem. But if it gives an instruction, it is extremely likely to touch upon the royal prerogative. An Act of Parliament cannot touch upon the royal prerogative, or various other things, but the prerogative is the relevant one, without the Queen's consent. The Queen's consent can be notified to Parliament by any Privy Councillor, but of course it is the Queen's consent. It can't be notified if it doesn't exist. So just because there is a Privy Councillor doesn't mean the Privy Councillor can stand up and say the Queen has given consent. The Queen only gives consent on the advice of the government, particularly the Prime Minister. So Queen's consent could be withheld, which would mean the bill could not complete its stages. There's points 1 and 2. And the third, the fallback, the final option, is the government simply prorogues Parliament and then a bill falls.
So you're saying that the Queen could be put in an impossible
No, it's not the Queen at all.
This
is no, you misunderstand. So come on, you know you're misunderstanding because this is absolute ABC of our Constitution. The Queen's name is used in all sorts of things, but the Queen is not acting of her own accord, she is acting on the advice of her ministers. This is a matter of formal prime ministerial advice. It's completely routine, these Crown
I'm
consents.
just wondering, in these highly charged political times, if you can tell that to the tabloids or indeed to the Speaker.
The Queen's powers, we all understand this, that the Queen's prerogative powers are exercised by the Prime Minister. That's very well known. The only occasion when the Prime Minister's advice is not authoritative is on the selection of a new Prime Minister.
Trying to veer me away from one explosive suggestion, so can I take you to the next one you've made, which is that I think you were suggesting that in extremis, the Queen, on advice of the Prime Minister, as you would remind me, can simply shut down the Commons. Are you recommending that should happen?
No, it's not shutting down the Commons. Prorogation merely interrupts the Commons. The Commons could re-meet within a few days. Just requires Parliament to be reopened.
You're not suggesting, I have heard this floated, that Parliament could be prorogued until after, never mind a few days, until after March the 29th.
I think that's one of those things that is constitutionally interesting, but would be very unwise. I think that would be an abuse of the Constitution.
Have you heard that suggested, by the way?
No, I haven't heard it suggested as something that anybody would do. I've heard it suggested in the way that people talk about theoretical things that could happen, but are in reality beyond the realms of possibility. I think the idea that the Commons simply wouldn't sit for 70 odd days is very, very unrealistic and would be a major constitutional crisis. But I think that legislation could be interrupted by prorogation is perfectly reasonable, because we're very near the end of the session anyway. The session's due to end in April. You would only be bringing the prorogation forward briefly, and then you would have the Queen's speech and the debate on the Queen's speech and the amendments to the Queen's speech, but you then are back in control of the timetable.
What do you think of what the Speaker did last week?
I think two things that people may feel slightly contradictory. I think the Speaker made an error, but I think he made an honest error. I don't think the Speaker is biased. I think the Speaker's guiding principle is a good one, that the House of Commons should debate what it wants to debate. But I think that on this occasion, the reinterpretation of the word forthwith creates considerable problems for the House of Commons itself. For example, Standing Order 44, which allows the Speaker to expel somebody for misconduct in the chamber, says that the motion will be taken forthwith. That's always meant without debate and without amendment. Now, if Mr. Speaker wishes to expel somebody, another member could move an amendment to his motion. And Mr. Speaker would find it very difficult on the precedent he'd just set not to accept that amendment.
So I think he said he'd reflect on whether he'd set a precedent at all.
The Speaker always sets precedents. I mean, if you look at the Commons journals, what the Commons journals report is the decisions of the Speaker. And those decisions are then looked at by clerks and by future speakers to determine how they should behave. Otherwise, conduct from the chair becomes completely arbitrary. The Speaker can't say that today forthwith means with amendment and tomorrow forthwith means without amendment. That doesn't make any sense. That's why I think it was a mistake, because forthwith runs throughout the standing orders and has been always taken to mean without amendment and without debate. And the slightly ridiculous part of his decision was that if you have an amendment without debate, because he accepted that forthwith means without debate, nobody knows what the amendment's trying to achieve because there's nobody there to explain it. It's not allowed to explain it.
Let me ask you another question, forthwith.
Yeah.
In other words, now. I'm not going to pause, but I'll ask it straight away, which is, this decision he made was intensely politically controversial in the context of Brexit. It's clearly advised not to do it by the clerks. He didn't seem to me to give any particular convincing reason for explaining why he did it. In that context, what do you mean by saying he made an honest mistake? Many of our listeners will assume and conclude it was bias.
I think his general bias is to protect the interests of the House of Commons, and that's a right bias for a Speaker. And therefore I don't think it was a bias for or against Brexit. I think he would have done the same had the case been reversed.
You're an admirer of the Speaker, are you not?
I am an admirer of the Speaker. I think he has done a lot of good for the House of Commons and the standing of the House of Commons. within our political life and has ensured that the House of Commons debates what is important to the nation at large. I simply think this decision was technically wrong.
Were you surprised by it?
Yes, I was, because before Christmas there was the question as to whether the government had to continue the debate, having set a programme motion for it. And the Speaker, on the advice of the clerks, followed the convention of saying that if the orders of the day weren't moved, the debate couldn't continue. And therefore I assumed that on issues where there was a very clear and well-established precedent, he would stick to the clear and well-established precedent.
Let's turn from the Speaker to what will happen tomorrow. I mean, first, this, in a way, is a statement of the obvious or a question of the obvious. But how do we differentiate in what we read and hear between what is government spin, or spin from anyone else for that matter, and what is real? I mean, the government, as we put it on Con Home, is going to play a game of chicken. It's trying to frighten you into thinking there'll be no Brexit. It's trying to frighten the ultra-Remainers into thinking there will be no deal. It's trying to squeeze the EU into making concessions. So how much of all what we read and hear, particularly about Speaker, constitutional innovations, Dominic Grieve moving bills, Nick Bowles consulting the liaison committee, I mean, how much of this and which bits should we take seriously?
Well, it's very difficult to know. We are at an absolute crunch point that in just over 70 days we will leave the European Union. That is in law. There are people who have given their whole political lives to promoting the interests of the European Union. They believe in it, almost an article of faith. And they will do almost anything they can to stop the referendum which they think was wrong, was a mistake, and basically shouldn't be allowed. They don't have sufficient confidence in democracy. They think they know best and that they should save the country from itself. And if they haven't done it within this very short period, then their great aim is thwarted, is stopped, and will never return. If we leave at 11 o'clock in the evening on 29th of March, we're not going to rejoin. We're not going to find that it's easy to reverse or that an ex post facto Article 50 extension can be sought. We've left, and that's it. And so they have to throw everything they can at it, even to destabilising the Constitution, because they care more about the European superstate than they do about the nation's constitution. It's very irresponsible, it's quite revolutionary, but their commitment is to the overarching might and power of the European Union.
Do you think the government will lose by a significant margin tomorrow?
I think forecasting results of votes a few hours before they take place, by the time this is broadcast, is a silly thing to do.
If the government loses, what do you think will happen next?
I imagine the Prime Minister will make a statement relatively quickly. I imagine that she will go back to Brussels and say, look, this doesn't work, and will be seeking some amendment to her deal, though at this stage I would expect it to be a pretty fundamental amendment to her deal.
Can she fend off a vote on a series of options, including a second referendum?
The thing is, if you have this series of options, how do you then get it into legislation in time before we've left? What are you trying to achieve?
It wasn't quite the question I was asking. I was simply asking whether you think if she loses tomorrow, a vote of that kind is likely.
It's possible, but I don't think it gets us anywhere. I think you could very easily find that every option was voted down. Danny Finkelstein had a very good article, which was reprinted in The Sun, saying that the people who are opposing no deal are quite incapable of proposing what they want instead, and that this leaves it very difficult for anybody to follow what they're trying to do, that actually, if they want to avoid no deal, the logic of their position is they ought to support Mrs May's deal because that's the only deal in town.
You still think the clock is running down and the clock is on your side don't you? And that might explain why, in my view, the ERG has been relatively quiet recently, amidst all this noise from Mr. Grieve and Mr. Bowles and others.
Well, there's that great line, isn't there, about looking at the crickets in the field, making the noise, whilst the sturdy oxen stand by, not making any noise. I seem to remember it's Edmund Burke. And we are the sturdy oxen, and the crickets chirrup away.
And in the event of a no confidence vote, are you absolutely committed to supporting the government?
Yes.
Is that the position of the ERG as a whole?
The ERG in that sense doesn't have a collective position, but I don't know of anybody within the ERG who would vote against the government in a vote of confidence.
And if the Northern Ireland Protocol was to be removed from the withdrawal agreement, would you vote for this deal?
I would have a great deal of sympathy for this deal if the whole of the backstop were removed. Most of the poison in the deal is in the backstop, and articles like Article 4, which make it superior law, with everything else they run out of time.
Yes.
So there are still obstacles. There's still the £39 billion. There's still a number of the uncertainties within the deal. But unquestionably, the primary difficulty is the backstop.
When you talk to your Brexiteer colleagues, do you find that view's their view mostly?
No. I think most people take a tougher line than I do and think the withdrawal agreement, even if you took the backstop out, is so bad that they couldn't live with it. So I think there are problems with the withdrawal agreement, but I think the greater problem is with the backstop. Whether I would vote for it, well, we'd have to see what changes were made. I wouldn't want to...
So what you're telling me is a large number of your Brexiteering colleagues, we run a very conservative list and had 70 who say they won't support it, not counting the probables and possibles. What you're saying is that a lot of them would stick, that in addition, you'd actually need a bill, not just a simple vote, you need a bill to implement any approval of the deal afterwards. So therefore, it really is looking very difficult for this deal.
So yes, that must be right. If by some miracle the deal went through tomorrow, I'd still vote against the bill.
Why shouldn't Labour abstain and let the deal pass, thereby separating the DUP from the Conservative Party, thereby allowing them to table a vote of confidence with some prospect of winning it?
That is a very good question. You should pose that to your socialist friends. I'm not really able to...
I don't have enough to give me a representative
answer.
I'm just asking you to ask some of yours.
It is an interesting question. What tactically does the Labour Party want? My guess is that the Labour Party thinks that if the government is defeated heavily, that is the greatest moral claim for a general election, even if they can't win a vote of confidence. Though tactically, you're probably right that their greatest chance of a general election would be if they let it go through. So you may want to ask yourself, does the Labour Party not in fact want a general election? Does the Labour Party just want disorder? I mean, it is the opposition. The job of the opposition is to oppose. Does it just want things muddling along and not really want to take...
Well, a response to the question is this, I suppose, that they could abstain. They could thereby try to let the motion pass and the deal pass. They could gamble. I think it would then be a gamble that the DUP really would part from the government. They might not. But I'm with you in thinking that Jeremy Corbyn's natural tendency is to want to oppose, and that anything that puts the crisis off until later doesn't, in his view, hold out very much for him. He wants to keep pressing for the crisis now, but I may be wrong.
I think your analysis is extremely sensible. I don't know whether it's right, because I don't know the inner workings of Mr. Corbyn's mind, but I think it makes sense from their point of view to keep the pressure up, to make things as difficult as possible for the government, and keep that going.
You haven't asked him to come to the ERG to give an account of himself?
No, that was a joke.
I'm just asking since it was reported.
It is funny. I think we should hold our meetings in public because they are leaked so quickly. There's no point in pretending that they're private.
Do you feel you can console yourself with the thought that they don't leak as quickly and in as much detail as meetings of the Cabinet?
Well, that is true, yes.
Are you aware of any circumstance in which a member of the ERG has briefed the media in advance about what they'll say at an ERG meeting? I ask because this is now apparently happening in relation to Cabinet meetings.
No, I'm not aware of that happening, though I am aware that the most I've noticed was that I was making introductory comments at the beginning of an ERG meeting, and the person sitting next to me showed me that what I had said at the beginning had been tweeted before I'd concluded my remarks, which is quite a quick dissemination.
Just on a serious point, and it's a bit of the architecture that tends to get missed in all this. Shouldn't the Cabinet make up its mind what it wants? Obviously the answer is yes, so I suppose I'm asking really whether this situation is sustainable. You have members of the Cabinet like Greg Clark and David Gauke hinting that they'll resign if no deal approaches. You've got other members who are well-established Brexiteers who supported leave. You've got other members like Jeremy Hunt who supported Remain in the referendum but are now mighty keen on Singapore. I mean, a very senior member of the lobby said to me, perhaps thinking back to the film Black Hawk Down, it's a political Mogadishu, he said, out there, as it were, with Cabinet members driving jeeps around, wearing ammo belts and firing off shots into the air.
Well, at least it's not a Rees-Mogg issue. That is reassuring. The breakdown in collective responsibility is extraordinary. And bear in mind, the Prime Minister said at Chequers that now Cabinet collective responsibility was being restored, and that's why David Davis and Boris Johnson resigned. And I think her failure to insist upon that is a sign of not so much weakness as an unwillingness to follow through on what she said. I don't understand why she hasn't been more ruthless about this.
Isn't it important, or might it be, in terms of the future of the country as well as in the high or low politics of the business, in that if by some chance the deal went through and a bill went through, we would then have to decide, so vague are the terms of the political agreement, whether we wanted a high alignment model closer to Norway or a low alignment model closer to Canada, and the Cabinet cannot make up its mind.
One of the horrors of the deal is that we go through all of this again and again and again. One of the virtues of leaving without a deal is at least it's then decided. And you're absolutely right. The political declaration is so vague that it could be any outcome. And so we will have to carry on battling away to try and get the outcome that we want. If we leave without a deal, the ERG can be cryogenically frozen for a bit. We won't need to be enormously active. People will have some respite from seeing me on their television screens. But if we go on, then we've got to try and make sure that we get a Canada-style free trade agreement rather than the high alignment that restricts all our opportunities once we've left and becomes closet membership of the EU.
In fact, this may be a suitable point to end on. One of the main arguments Downing Street was pushing before Christmas, and still is as far as I know, is let's get this deal through and let's get this whole debate over. But it is true, isn't it, that were the deal to get through, it wouldn't be the end. It wouldn't even be the end of the beginning.
I'm afraid your quotation of Churchill is right.
Jacob, thank you very much.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.